Let's dive in by talking about 2020. I want to get to the Iraq War and Al Qaeda and all of that, the military background in a few minutes. But I want to start with here and now, COVID-19, 2020. What's the most important learning, Chris, that you and your team have gained watching teams in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, where do you start with that?
Right.
Because there's so many things going on.
Yeah.
But if you narrowed it down to, I think the conversations that you drive, Russ, around sort of teams and leadership, I think I'd make a few observations. One, and I do think there's positive outcomes on all these. One is, and we all know this, for part of the generation of the workforce, this is their first thing, right? This is their 9/11. This is their economic crisis, et cetera. First time they, in their professional careers, they've been hit on head on. What's probably unique and different for them versus, what you and I would have gone through on 9/11 or in the financial crash, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
is the whole world's involved in this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
their leaders at all levels are just as confused as they are, right? So they're going to come through this just gritty and hardened in a way that previous generations haven't seen. I would say even that in the, Gen X 9/11 sort of world. So there's a tough challenge for them, but also a long-term upside. They'll be great CEOs as a result of this, right? Because they're seeing us kind of try to figure it out, right? That's that. I think that's an important area. And then the other is the now that it's becoming really normalized. Like this is going to be how we communicate for a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to be the forever norm, but it's also not going to go away
Meaning
in the next.
virtually Zoom meetings, that kind of thing, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Connected in this sort of distance-based fashion, and I think there's also a lot of upside that's going to come out of that. We're learning to communicate differently with different parts of our organization because the cost of entry to this, we could put 300 people on this meeting right now,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't. No one's getting on flights, so more voices are coming into organizations, and senior leaders are figuring out. And I really starting to recognize there's a real upside to this. I never knew about that young woman in Seattle who is driving this account, and she is now in these meetings and educating all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's really what one of the points of brilliance that McChrystal unlocked by doing this far before, it was the norm back in the counterterrorism world, was just that you had this collective access to so many brilliant minds because of this method of communication.
Gotcha. Yeah, you think about COVID-19, and then you think about the social unrest, which is, people demanding a seat at the table and saying, "Hey, are you listening to my voice?" And you think about that merging of technology, and then that need to hear more voices. And Chris, I see so much value in what you just said. I think every organization's exactly having the conversation with that you're talking about. We can access more voices easily, and we need to, right? So let me go from. We'll come back to the present in a minute, but now I want to take you to the past. What remind everyone just a quick overview of General Stanley McChrystal. You all were part of the team that wrote the book with him. What experiences were you coming off of when you wrote the book Team of Teams?
Yeah, so General Stan McChrystal retired as a four-star and essentially oversaw the transformation of special operations from a top-down, bureaucratic, structured, very linear, controlled, whatever word you want to use, organizational model,
Mm-hmm.
which it had evolved. Like the history of special operations goes back, thousands of years if you want to go back to the Spartans, et cetera. But in U.S. history, really sort of gets a little bit of taste in World War II, gets its legs under it in Vietnam, and then really starts to evolve the last 2 decades of the 20th century in the counterterrorism space. These more very laser focused elite units that fly around the world and rescue hostages. That's sort of the Hollywood lore of it. And so McChrystal had taken those forces over as a two-star general in 2003, right as Iraq is starting to unfold. The history of that part of the military, which by the way is like this small little rounding error when personnel wise relative to the big machine of the U.S. military, but it had always been very vertically structured. By that I mean I have this unit that is on this part of the org chart that's hyper focused on this type of mission. So when that comes up, I'm going to send word to them. They're going to go do a thing and then come back. And so I had joined that part of the community right as McChrystal was taking over the whole enterprise as a young officer on the sort of tactical level. And he quickly recognized we are really good at going down and up. And we're fighting now. If you look, this is as things were starting to unfold in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq was really starting to become this formidable threat. He said they don't have a top down. They have a center out and across. They are this network thing, and they've become a network because the access to global communications is zero. The barrier of entry is nothing. And so if you can get a Hotmail account, you can communicate with anybody in the world. We've given them that technology. And therefore, they're not building any sophisticated top-down traditional terrorist thing. They're just a network of like-minded individuals that's growing at a rate that we can't keep up with. Therefore, we need to network ourselves in a similar fashion. So he kind of changed everything. Like aside from the tactical, he said, we got the right people. They're really good on the ground. What we don't do well is organizational stuff. We don't communicate across boundaries well. We don't make decisions. We don't empower leaders at the front line to make decisions based on new information. They feel the need to come up and wait for word to come back down, et cetera. So I'm gonna drive a change process so we communicate faster with more transparency so that our frontline leaders can be empowered with the right information to make independent decisions, essentially. And that became this concept of team of teams, or this, how do I create a teaming mentality at this massive scale? And then when he left the service about 10 years ago, there was a recognition that the McChrystal group formed around this idea set that says, look, every big organization is facing some version of this problem. So that's why we wrote Team of Teams, and that's the work we've been doing in our consulting practice ever since.
So, Chris, you've been thinking about this for what, 15 years now?
Yeah.
I mean, 10, 15 years, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
So isn't it crazy? I mean, maybe I'm viewing this wrong, but as I hear you describe that, and then with the exposure that I've got, you've got to organizations around the world across different industries, it's crazy to me that was what started with terrorist organizations. And now it's the model, really, that every organization of large size that I'm familiar with is feeling the need to go that direction. That's got to be interesting and ironic to you as well?
Yeah, no, it's I feel really lucky to have been, at the right time, working around the right leaders for someone like McChrystal when all this started to unfold. And at least intellectually, you step on this up elevator of like, kind of randomly, you end up as front and center with a problem that everybody's going to wrestle with for the next, 2 decades probably.
Right.
And, even the current pandemic, it's just an example of that. Like a disease spread like this, it's the same as a terrorist network. That was the spread of an ideology, and you just need a host that's frustrated enough to join your movement. This is a disease looking for human hosts, and you can put up traditional barriers to say, you can't come in this restaurant, which is a good part of that's your sort of structured part, but the disease doesn't care. It's going to find the lazy person who wanders to the next place and go, okay, here's new hosts I can jump into. And you have to come up with a dual-pronged approach to fight any of these networked threats that are manifesting, just everywhere you look. This is sort of the new norm that we have to figure out.
So organizations over time, and you all talk about this in the book, and there's a line that I want to quote here in a minute that I think is just brilliant. I highlighted it when I was reading it on a Kindle. Well, maybe I'll go with the line first. It says, the rules and limitations that once prevented accidents now prevent creativity. The rules and limitations that once prevented accidents. Think of the structure of organizations created over time, silos and hierarchy, chain of command. Now they're preventing creativity. Man, do I see that all the time. That's so true. And the book is a case for change. You're making a case for change, that we need to think differently. Hence the name, New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World, the subtitle. New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World. So here's the question. What are the biggest obstacles to organizations making those changes?
Well, let me start first with a little comment on what you just said around the obstacles to the key indicators and why things like that happen, right? And we always try to make the point, this is not there's not a boogeyman behind the screen, right? This is not evil people inside your organization
Right.
trying to undermine your strategy. This is, and like yourself, we've done so much work now in this space, in these spaces. This is really good, hardworking people who are well trained to do a specific job, and they're really good at it. When you boil down, why aren't we getting there on project X? Or why are we behind like the startup competition when it comes to this type of innovation? When you get down to that level, you'll find two, simplifying it a bit, but not too much. You find two really good people, two really good teams who are like, yeah, they think this, we think this, the gears are grinding. So we've pushed it up to ask Russ what he thinks. And Russ doesn't know. So it's gone to Chris, and then it goes up and up and up. And this is why C-suites don't get any sleep anymore, because all these gray space or network problems roll up and up because there's nothing in the rule book that gives me authority to solve that problem.
Nobody's
Right.
making those decisions at the lower level, right? They just keep escalating.
Right, because the decision the system wasn't designed to solve for that, right?
Mm.
And so it was designed to say when you reach a point of uncertainty, call the person above you. And now there's so many levels of uncertainty that way too many things roll up. Nobody gets the basic work done anymore, and C-suite can't focus on strategy. And so to get through that sort of change cycle, the hurdles are one. I would name the big ones. One, identifying and agreeing that there's an issue, right? And so in our work, I will constantly lay out, like, let me give you our theory of the case. And here's what we believe. You have to create an organization that retains the strength and stability of a traditional hierarchy or bureaucratic model, because great things happen there. The reason stoplights work is because someone with a clipboard makes sure they work. And that's a very deliberate process, and we all benefit. But you need to integrate into that this sort of network dynamic, faster, more distributed communications. And so if you don't agree with that thesis, or you think you can run your business effectively just through the traditional model, then you should do that, because that's an easier, more controllable model. And we have hundreds of years of history to show us that. Now, if you can identify that that's an insufficient solution, then you need to come up with the theory why and start explaining it to your people. I find that's the biggest first challenge, is leaders saying, not only do I feel this in my gut and the numbers are kind of hinting at it, I can articulate the story behind why we need to go through this and communicate it with my people. It's not enough to just say we should be better, right? Because we're talking about real change here. And then when you get past that, there's the old, I'm sure you've seen the sort of joking business cartoons of, who thinks we should change? Everybody raise their hand. Who wants to change? Nobody
That's
raises
right.
their
Who
hand.
wants to go first?
Right. It's always your fault, not mine. Right.
Yeah.
That's the other major hurdle, is then convincing people. And that's all about sort of stakeholder analysis and getting people on board and telling the right stories, et cetera. So, identifying and telling a story, and then starting to get people's heads around it to be part of that process. There's lots of other things, but those are the two big buckets you got to hit.
Chris, you think that's it? Your answer made me think of something that I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You think there are some organizations that don't need to move to this model of more
Yeah,
network based and fewer silos and more flat and sharing of information.
yeah. I don't think it's a lot. I think the vast majority need to be thinking about this. But I will also say I'm not in the business of convincing, right? Because this takes some intellectual curiosity and leaders that are observing the world, which, as you know, like 98% are there. But if I get if I'm in a conversation and people say I don't really think this is the way the world is working, then I'll say that's great. You should run it like you always have, and let's talk in a few years. Now, I think if you go far enough down, like if you have a more simpler business model, if you run a barber shop in a local community, sure, it's kind of a structure. I know what my consumer base is. I know how often they get their haircut. Aside from that, you should be thinking more deeply.
Well, and I think the case for change is so strong, and I absolutely agree. I think it's brilliant what you said about. I'm not in the business of trying to convince you. I think that's totally true. But there are a lot of mid-level managers who are trying to convince the leaders above them, and they're not finding a receptive audience, or at least they encounter nodding heads but not changed behavior, right? And to me, one of the big cases for change is look at the most successful organizations that are growing market share in any industry. And my mind immediately goes to one of the biggest examples, of course, of Amazon, and the way they operate, the way numerous companies that are growing market share is what you're advocating in the book. It's what you're championing here. They are creating a culture that's like that, while their competitors in their industry or other industries are sticking to, you know what, stand and salute, if you will, even if they're not obviously a military culture. And so I think those that hold on to power in the old way, in my opinion, are those that are really scared to change or near retirement. And so they'll leave that to somebody else. But let me ask you a couple other questions that are on my mind after reading the book. There's another line in the book that I think is really, really brilliant, and it says the two major determinants of idea flow. The two major determinants of idea flow are engagement and exploration. Engagement and exploration. Can you define those terms as they're applied in that sentence and say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the design of how a bureaucracy is supposed to work, right? Where we talk a lot about Taylorism in Team of Teams, and then explore it in more depth in some of our follow-on work. And I'm sure most of your listeners would be familiar with Frederick Winslow Taylor, who said, hey, as we learn to put people together into organizational structures to make products, there's a science behind that. So he came up with the idea of scientific management, really through a production lens. I want to, and this is 150 years ago, right? As we roll into the Industrial Revolution, how do I make, better pencils than the competitor, right? I want to use the minimal amount of resources. I want to guarantee that it's the right product every time it rolls off the line. And then once I have that in place, I can start to optimize for cost, for least amount of input, most amount of output, least cost to my personnel, et cetera. Not saying that's good or bad, but it's a really efficient system. And you're in that model, Taylor was saying, and there was not a good relationship between managers and workers then, obviously, and very different, almost there was a class structure, obviously, that was driving some of that. But he was saying, if you're the right leadership team, management team, you should control every decision you possibly can at your level and just tell these people down here what to do. Now, that's a bad system in a modern world, and it's a dangerous system in a networked world. But there's nothing in Taylorism that says, how do you engage and connect with people? Because it doesn't matter what they're thinking, it doesn't matter what they're seeing. They should only swing the hammer the number of times you tell them per minute. Put the bolt in the thing, produce the product, don't ask questions. And so the idea is no longer applicable, but B, the behavior that comes out of that suppresses engagement and innovative thinking, not only up and down, but between verticals. Remember, Taylor used to separate teams by time and distance on the assembly line so that they didn't do what humans do, which is interact and say, how's your bolt working over there? What if we did it like this? Because Taylor was like, they'll just undermine your guarantee.
Head down, do the job, right? That's what we need.
Do the job, keep them away from each other. And so you have to change your communication models. Like, how do you literally use technology to pull people into discussion in today's world? And then your behavior. How do I ask the right questions as a leader or leadership team to really get you to get beyond the spreadsheet or the metrics and say, Russ, I can see the green lights and the yellow lights on your spreadsheet. That's great. I understand what that means. Why do you think that's happening? Tell me something I don't know about your corner of the market that we can all learn from, which is a different sort of conversation now. That's when you can really create frontline insight and engagement from leaders. And we're big believers that they're leaders at every level of your organization. Have them bring their insights into the broader system. And then we collectively can become a learning organization. That's what everybody shoots for now. But that's easy to say, hard to do without disciplined senior folks that create a model to make it all possible.
So, Chris, you oversee this, McChrystal Group, and in your consulting and work with organizations. As I'm listening to you over these last 20 minutes or so, I'm wondering, when you're working with a client or with organization, how much of the work is structural, systems versus culture, the way you show up?
Yeah, so our organization is built around, we have three main verticals inside of our group based on our own experiences. One is a data analytics team that will go in and assess how the networks are actually functioning inside of a big system, and displaying the human network mapping. And that was derivative of our own experience of trying to understand the human network of Al Qaeda. We realized we have to know what this looks like before we can start to deal with it. Otherwise, you're just like smashing a hammer into the darkness, right? So that's one vertical. The other two are exactly what you said: operational implementation, and then the behavioral change that has to support that. I like to say, all roads lead to Rome. All roads lead to a teaming model at scale. And you can start through, hey, we want to work with leaders, high pose, leader development programs, et cetera. Or we want to start with, communication, structural change. I want to map out all of my decision-making processes, et cetera. And if you were that executive, I would say, Russ, we'll start wherever you want. But I'm going to tell you one thing. If you start with driving the type of behavior that's necessary for a network methodology to take over, eventually you're going to recognize I need to adjust my communications, or the inverse.
Gotcha.
But for us, it's about a 50-50 split where it starts.
Gotcha. So let's, in our last few minutes together, Chris, is so fascinating. I could talk about this for hours. Obviously, I make my living in this space, approaching it from one avenue, and you make your living doing the same from a different avenue. Although there's a lot of there's some overlap, as there is in anytime you're working on becoming a sharper leader. Here's the question. So for me, let's say I don't have the keys to the organization. I can't bring about change across the enterprise, but I do work in a large organization potentially, and I just want to know how to demonstrate more of the leadership style you advocate based off of your experience. What does that look like? Give me a few tips on how I might show up differently starting tomorrow.
Yeah. So probably like yourself, more times than I can remember, you get a question from that mid-level or frontline leader. Hey, I just took over a 6-person team, or I'm running this 30-person unit, et cetera. I get this, but my executive team isn't there yet. How do I convince them? And that's a really hard
Or how do I
thing to do.
start the change here and try to
Right.
convince them through what they see on my team?
Which is exactly what we advise. Like,
Right.
don't pound your head against the wall. Do great things down and in, and they'll recognize it, right? And so the same models apply, right? Everything we've written about. The only reason that what was unique and different about what McChrystal did was it was really good team level leadership at a 30,000 person global scale, right? Which is not normal in certainly 15, 20 years ago, right? To try to create trust-based relationships at scale, right? And so anyone, I'll tell a younger leader, look, if you can put your arms around your team, like that's 8 of you and you're in the same building, or it's 20 of you and you talk every day, then that's your little ecosystem, and start working down and into that. And the first thing I always tell them is sit down with your people and say, what's working and what isn't. And the simplest, and that will lead to a better style and methodology for communication. Start right there. And so the model I always suggest to them is what we've been talking about. Get at a whiteboard and put a bureaucratic model on one side. Say, look, this is Smith Incorporated, where we all work. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, put some sort of network complex problem over here. And then have your people list out, what are the things we do on this side that are really good and effective, and we have to do them right? Because if we're in pharmaceuticals, we can't just take risk. There are lots of things that happen in that space that save people's lives. So list those things out. And then in this column, what are the things that we can't keep up with anymore, that are changing too fast? And right there, leaders at every level will start to see, okay, we have to maintain this structure and stability as we communicate differently to be able to solve these problems. I've found it just a great foundation start point. Then a smart leader will say, okay, that means we're not communicating effectively. We're not pulling in these voices because she knows about that problem over there every time before it gets to me. So let's just talk more often. And I don't just talk to me. I want you to talk to the whole team.
Right.
and it works really well no matter what level.
Well, you're making me think. It goes back to those two words that I asked you about earlier: engagement and exploration. What you just described is a leader doing that, right? Getting their team engaged and then exploring, asking for their perspective. Our time is up, Chris. Man, what valuable insight. The book is. I know it's been out for several years. I'm sure people are still discovering it every day. That's the beauty of writing a book. For those that maybe have read it or haven't read it but are interested in connecting with you or the firm, how do they do that?
Yeah, McChrystal Group. We're on all the social media platforms. They can go to our website. We try to give a really good breakdown of our approach, and especially over the last 5 or 6 months, because the COVID pandemic is so relevant or parallels our own experiences.
All right.
We've tried to put out just playbook after playbook of stuff that might be helpful to leaders at every level that are trying to think through different styles of communication, et cetera. So a lot of resources hung on there as well.
So just Google McChrystal Group or on a social media platform website, you should be able to find it. All righty, perfect. Hey, Chris, thank you so much for your insight, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Russ. Appreciate it. Have a great day.